I am going to just briefly introduce a couple of concepts and ideas, and then you're going to learn an awfully lot more about those in a few minutes when we hear from both John and Greg Newman. So I've just borrowed this graphic from Nathan Bennett's broader conceptualization of environmental stewardship, and in particular wanted to encourage the group to think about this kind of social ecological context, right, in which all the things around us are happening, and then thinking about the actions that individuals take within that context to affect the outcome of the things that are happening. We can think about actors, we can think about capacity, we can think about motivation. And then with this idea, I sort of juxtapose the broader notion of that kind of very typical adaptive management cycle, where, again, we think about it. Whoops, sorry. And are folks here familiar with the adaptive management cycle, right? This has probably been talked about as ad nauseum, so I don't want to kind of beat this to death, but the idea is it's really focused on the kinds of things that individuals do to adaptively and iteratively sort of shape actions around environmental management. And so again, I bring up that kind of word action, but again, that's happening in that same social ecological sphere. And so if we take these two ideas, which I argue are pretty closely nested, and we think about how we can take environmental stewardship, some folks have talked about it in the context of civic ecology, participatory management, and then put it in this broader context of what we can think about in terms of best practices in adaptive management, we have, and again, pieces of community, right? The people taking the actions, whether they be professionals or novices. We have the kinds of things that people are doing in this context. And then we have this bigger and broader capacity, right? And so I've sort of mapped the two constructs together to think about the kind of who, the what, and what that capacity might look like. And again, we're going to revisit the notion of capacity at the end of the talk. But if we think about these two and bringing them together, I argue there's a space for citizen science or participatory research, or what is it, public participation in scientific research. There's been so many names. Community science has been recently brought up as being particularly important because we acknowledge not everyone is citizens. We've just chosen in our series here to talk about citizen science in this context because we feel that it is a name that's pretty commonly used, but we're not necessarily arguing it's the best name. And so citizen science in itself, I mean, are folks here familiar with that construct, right? We've talked about it a lot. People have really debated the idea of, you know, who professionals are, who are the amateurs, what does that look like? The idea is that their research has consequences, right? There are outcomes of these research questions that cause people to think about things differently or to do things differently, and that's the important piece. There have been several models about what that might look like. I've presented in the past largely about contributory type citizen science, which we'll talk about a little bit again today, but the idea that people can go out, they gather data, they collect it, and they give it to the scientist or the team who's in charge, and sort of contrast that with something that's more participatorily engaged, right? Here in this context, the community has come together and isolated a problem and began to pick and decide how they're going to solve that problem and who they need to engage to solve that problem. And sometimes that means bringing in scientists as consultants. And the outcomes of citizen science, of course, we can think about publications, we can think about new observations. The sheer number of observations put out by laypersons, and especially in terms of biodiversity, is just really huge. We can also think about long-term monitoring. We can think about really harnessing the local knowledge of places and finding a way to aggregate that and hold that, so that way we can build on that. Or when change happens, we have a baseline. And so again, sort of changing gears here, and I apologize for the rough transition, but that's sort of the background of citizen science and how we talked about it in this team, in this context of this case study, and how we're thinking about what that means. The case study itself, and you're going to hear a lot more about it, but the idea is having individuals help to gather information in these fire scars out in California, and those are basically regions that follow wildfires, right? So that picture was taken actually just outside of Santa Barbara. And the idea is, in the two fires in particular, the Thomas and Whittier fires in Southern California that ravaged the areas, they made the news. There's been a lot of information about that. And so our goal was to say, okay, if we're going to sort of engage people in this endeavor, number one, compared to project experts, right? Are the citizen scientists in this context, are they able to generate accurate data? But in particular, what are the costs, both financially and otherwise, in doing so? And so basically, volunteers were engaged through advertising through several networks in the area, working also with the Santa Barbara Botanical Garden. There were a number of individuals recruited into the project. These years were COVID-19 years, so what was planned to be in person actually had to move to online largely. And so with over 200 people trained online and in person, 97 individuals ended up collecting data. So that's about a 50% retention rate, which is not unusual, and I'd argue in comparing to other cases might be a little bit higher compared to some of those other cases. And then the volunteers were asked to collect data. In particular, the data that we're going to talk about, or that I'm going to talk about here, are data on specific plants. And individuals gathered information about number, area, percent cover, and some information with the surrounding terrain. They entered data into iNaturalist and AnecData. AnecData does take terrain type measurements and other types of measurements. And the individuals were, again, either trained in person, online, and they were given a number of resources and guides that would help them identify these plants. And then they were assigned an area to go and walk and then again look for these specific plants and species. The volunteers that joined the project, a number of the largest group that joined the project were individuals that had just very little experience in botanical knowledge. So what you're looking at behind me is sort of the number of volunteers on that y-axis and the proportion of volunteers participating. And then from sort of that X going on out, you're looking at very little experience onto a lot of experience. So you can see that little experience was the highest group compared to no. And then looking at sort of who collected data and who collected the most data, and not surprisingly, individuals who had the most botanical knowledge and experience were ones that contributed more data. The species, and I'll just show them very quickly for those of you who are familiar with the region of interest. They had the group 1, in which there was a great deal of training specifically focused on these species. They had a second group that was also an important group, but they didn't really focus the same amount of training on it. And then there was sort of a third group of, if people saw other species they thought was of interest, they could then report that information. So over 50 miles, well, the volunteers actually mapped a number of trails, but over 50 miles of those trails were used as comparison trails. That is, experts also walked those same trails. And so now we're looking at some data, some chi-square data, collecting the outcome of what it was the volunteers gathered compared to what it was the experts gathered. And pretty much all the species that were identified by the experts were identified by volunteers. So when it came to that initial ID in that group 1 species, there was that kind of complete overlap. Now, when it came to some of the other aspects, right, the number, the extent, the percent cover and things like that, some of those accuracy rates went down. Yep, go ahead. Oh, 5 minutes, sorry. I thought you were raising your hand. I was like, John, why are you raising your hand? We already practiced this. But okay. And so the experts tended to map greater extent. They tended to map larger covers and larger plots. And when it comes to the group 2 species, again, there was a great deal of overlap, but in that error around the nature of the data gathered was higher. And experts collected much more. If the level of expertise correlated with how much of that extra data you gathered, and experts by and large collected the most of it. So that is to say that these individuals, even if they had a lot of botanical experience, did stick in large ways to the protocol. And I just wanted to acknowledge Josie Lesage because these data came from her in the Santa Barbara Botanical Garden. And so if we compare also now the results of how much did it cost, how many hours did it take? You had 97 volunteers. They logged over 420 hours. That's 84 miles and 2,407 observations. And with that, about 350 hours of staff engaged in both training and creating and developing training materials. Compare that to 8 staff who did about double the amount of hours and many more miles, and about similar, if not a bit higher, in the 2,595 observations, and obviously they didn't require the training. And so when you look at those $2 amounts, you see a savings of about $20,000. Now, when we think about the training, and what does that actually mean? What does that $20,000 mean? What do those difference in hours mean? I mean, in one way, we can think about specific to citizen science projects, what kinds of experience do you need people to show up with? How likely are they to have it? When they come to a project, where are those sources of error likely to be? In this project, I talked about scale, extent, cover, some of those finer measurements, not necessarily at spotting or IDing the species. And when it comes to any kind of project that I think about developing citizen science training for, I think about where can those mistakes be made? And in this case, number one, they had to learn the plants, right? So they can go out there and do that. And number two, they had to ID it in the backdrop of the field. They had to learn the specific protocol around percent cover and other aspects. And they actually had to follow that protocol and turn in the data in the way that we want them to, right? So those can all be thought about as sources of error that then you can go back and calculate how much does your data set actually tolerate. And then you can think, all right, how do we improve those error rates? Sure. But also, are you likely to? What is the motivation versus the ability of these individuals, right? Can you give them tools to self-check or double-check their own error? And then if you know that error rate, could you just impose statistically corrections and just make sure you have enough individuals doing it, even if they're not particularly great at all aspects of the protocol? So basically the idea is understand your sources of variation and your error in these types of projects. But in addition, you know, when we think about the cost that it takes, right, to train, does that scale? If we think about the $20,000 saved, what if we just doubled the project or tripled the project or quadrupled the project, right? Is there going to be an economy of scale, or is it going to go the other direction? And so that's an important thing to really begin thinking about and aggregating. And then what are some other outcomes? And are those outcomes ones you want to gather, right? Or is it simply about the data? And so learning is one that we see reported pretty heavily. In this project, they did gather some self-report learning data. Not surprisingly, people said, yeah, I learned about plants. But when it came to the process of science, people said, well, you know, maybe not so much than what I came in. And that's a really common thing we see. Just because people are participating and following the actions doesn't mean that they're fully aware of what they're doing or now can take that and apply it in other context. In addition, though, what does it mean for the community? This happens to be a photo of a different project that I participated in where we engaged individuals in similar kinds of data collection where they went out, they gathered information, they brought it back. We asked very similar questions. But in this case, right, was it those learning gains I just talked about? they were pretty modest. But what else did we see in that kind of project? We saw an increased belief in personal and community action that will have broader impact. We saw a decrease in municipal activity. In this case, it was around mosquitoes. You might find that around invasive plant or fire control. And then an increase in feeling of personal responsibility around environmental problems writ large. So these are things we often don't collect, but might be having an impact, right? And this notion of capacity, which is going to be brought up in the next two talks, that is related to this stewardship and civic action that I just mentioned, really can be thought about, you know, in the citizen science context as providing that agency piece of capacity to think about this idea of monitor and adaptive management, which brings in sort of that magic word, which is the theme of what we talked about in this session, which is this kind of notion around resilience. And so even if they're not learning specific things, even if they're not gathering the most accurate data, are we going to see increased resilience amongst communities and their participation around decision making when they're actively engaged in these types of projects? And that's sort of the big question. And does this change last and persist? And so what we're going to do is go into two other aspects of the project, looking more specifically on how those data were used and what it means for the community who helped gather this information. So with that, I turn it over to you and then to Greg.
All right, thank you.
All right. Should I be doing something? Do you come right up?
All right,
Or does it?
All right, thank you. And so what we're going to do is we're going to hold questions for right now. We had some technical difficulty getting started, so we're going to do some catch up, but we have a 10-minute discussion period at the end of the three talks, and so we'll have questions at that point.
I'll give it time, but I need to collect my timer.
Okay, right. So, so there's no mouse moving anywhere.
I can see it moving.
Oh, not on my screen?
I have one, you know.
Look at the screen, the big screen.
Okay, so do you want to, you can't control this, right?
No.
All right, so this is my ability to go backwards. And that would be mine. I'll do this one. Yep. All right. So these are left and right. Okay, good. Okay, there we go. Okay, wonderful. Again, thanks everybody for coming to the last session. Really appreciate everybody being here. And so we're going to be talking about how to use citizen science and integrate it with a decision support system known as the Environmental Evaluation Modeling System. Getting into it, it's important to look at the big picture and recognize that we're losing ground right now in our fight to conserve biodiversity, not only with rare species, but also individuals. This is the Living Planet Index, and we've lost more than 50% of the individuals on the planet since 1970. And one of the primary drivers of that is habitat degradation, as well as invasive species and disease. And lately, it's become more and more apparent that wildfire is something that we need to put on our radar as ecologists and conservation biologists. We've always been trained in Ecology 101 that wildfire is really important for the ecosystems, but the amount of the scale and magnitude of fire that's happening now due to climate change is really quite overwhelming, and I would imagine is kind of a sleeping threat for conservation biology. And so I'll come back to that slide in a minute. One of the major issues with wildfire is that it opens the landscape up for invasive exotics to really move in. And when you have invasives comes in, it's not super intuitive, but they just really mess with the whole ecosystem and the balance. Also, fires are causing huge losses of topsoil and degradation of water quality. Also, mudslides. Here's a picture from Montecito, California, in which 91 people died because these mudslides came through the town and surprised everybody. So many people got injured, so much loss of property. And so we need post-wildfire management systems. And here's something I came up with on Sunday, which is the Post-Wildfire Restoration Management System, for lack of a better name. Comments are welcome. And so it's kind of this Venn diagram of wildfire recovery management, invasive species management, and erosion control, water quality, topsoil retention. Asking this question, where should we do restoration? And the system itself is replicable anywhere at multiple scales, customizable to the local priorities, and it's envisioned to link with an adaptive management actions database, possibly in a linked knowledge graph. It's good to see Patrick here in the audience. So where should we restore? This is a key question. You can create maps that show good priority areas, and in this case we combined all that data that we talked about, the citizen science data, which was really critical, with existing data to create a huge observations database, and then combine that with 11 other GIS layers into this logic model and analysis in the environmental evaluation modeling system. So what is EEMS? It's a system that's built and designed for collaboratively building and using models, working together as partnerships. It's open source. It can be used to build models by anyone. And it's really great in this collaborative development because it's transparent. You can see the inputs, you can see the structures, and so when you're looking at it on the screen at any given EEMS model, you can see on the left side, you can see the model, the logic model. You can click on the boxes to see what the structure is, the operators, the weights, the thresholds. That's all transparent, and then you can see the maps that go along with each click. It's also modular. You can build each branch on its own. You can transfer one branch from one project to another, one region to another, and that's another power of it. It's built on this concept of fuzzy logic, and especially fuzzy sets, which is this idea that when you're looking at nature and ecology, it's not a black and white world out there. A lot of times there's gradients. So in this example, we've got a gradient of road density, and so you're able to have these continuous functions and incorporate them into your logic. And when you're building your EEMS models, you can do it in ArcGIS Model Builder or in command line, either one. And then you upload it either into EEMS Online, which is on the left, which is an app designed specifically for viewing it, or into Databasin, which has a little pop-up viewer for that graphical user interface. And I'll show you those demonstrations in a minute here. The post-wildfire management system logic at this highest level is invasive management priority, and then also erosion priority and low regenerative capacity, and I'll explain those in a little bit more detail. As far as the invasive management priority, we built on the WHIPPET tool, and we're calling it WHIPPET Plus. And so this is a fantastic model and tool that is an ArcGIS model that allows you to run a model with a whole bunch of inputs. And so for each species on the landscape, you're mapping out all the populations of that species and the relative priority of managing those species regarding the ecological impact, the invasiveness, and the management facility of each population. And so with WHIPPET Plus, we re-engineered it, put it into EEMS so it's transparent and replicable, and it also runs automatically for all the species on your landscape. And then you can view all those bells and whistles. We also added some additional criteria that can be turned on and off if you want to be fundamentalist to WHIPPET. And I think I need to skip this slide, which, well, real quick, it's really digging into each one of those things, such as each ecological impact. It has a whole bunch of sub-criteria, such as is the species in an ecologically sensitive area or not? And you can have a whole branch underneath that. What's the size and density of the population, and so on and so forth for each one of those branches. And then for erosion, this is a great thing about EEMS is you can combine these multiple objectives and in a weighted combination. And so if you really wanted to just focus on invasives, you can turn the weight off for erosion. But if you're being funded by Proposition 1 to look at erosion, you can turn that on. And so that's what we're doing. And you can see, is there observed erosion? What areas are modeled to have erosion? And also what locations are expected to have low rate of plant regeneration. And so when it comes to low rates of plant regeneration, we use the PREP tool, which was a regenerative capacity, and really builds on this idea of that certain ecological communities are going to have different restoration potential after a fire. And so like if there's a lot of burls that like fire, they'll resprout and you don't need to worry about topsoil loss there. But if it's other seed required areas, then it's going to be a whole different story. And so now we're going to switch to this.
Okay, here we have the results of the post-wildfire restoration management system, and this is for the entire study area. This is on databasin.org, an online GIS data viewing platform created by Conservation Biology Institute and available free views for all of you. And thanks again for Wilberforce and other partners for funding the creation of this system. And if you want to look at the area just where the Forest Service is, it's just a portion of the study area. There's still some areas in red and orange that are coming up as high priority for restoration in different areas. And so you can zoom into the area right behind Montecito, for instance, and you can see that there's an area of particular interest. And you can go ahead also and explore the logic model that went into it. And so here is that invasive species branch, and you can see, yeah, for this area, it's invasive species is really lighting up this particular location. Erosion management priority, there's a lot of high priority areas. You can kind of even see that for the whole extent, what that looks like. And so you can also go ahead and explore each one of the, the branches all the way down. So for instance, risk of soil slips has shaking potential, slope, soil burn severity. You can see what that looks like for the whole region. So getting back to our sub area, you can also kind of back out of this a little bit, going back to the invasive species. You can kind of see what different invasive species were there via the model, but you could also go ahead and explore the underlying data of the model in Databasin. This is one of the things that's nice about it that you cannot do on eemsonline.org. And so looking underneath it, you can see what the landscape looks like. You can turn on different data layers. So here's the invasive species observations, for instance, and you can identify any one of these. And here's the actual picture that was taken in let's see, in Databasin, and there's a castor bean location there, and also a another castor bean location observation. You can see details of the observations, and even go ahead and click all the way through to the iNaturalist observation. Now what we did is we created invasive species populations based on the observations using a standard of practice of about a quarter mile between observations is the minimum, the maximum allowed. And you can go ahead and identify the populations that are present at a particular location. So for instance, right here, you have this observation where we've got 5 different species populations. We've got a fennel population. You can zoom out to see the extent of that fennel population, what's going to be involved to tackle that. But also there's other smaller populations that might be more manageable, like the giant reed population that's there. the castor bean population that's there, the top of the sticky snake root population, which is good to tackle from the upstream side, and French broom. So this might be a really good location to start doing some restoration efforts. Okay, there's more that could be said here. You could explore other data layers that are in the database, and thank you. Okay, you could also view the data in EEMS Online, which is another graphical user interface that we created. And this user interface is a little bit faster for clicking through and exploring the different components of the logic model. Like here we are in risk of soil slips. There's the soil burn severity model. And so, yeah, and then also in this, you also have the opportunity to go ahead and explore the changing of the weights. And you can go ahead and type in different weights, for instance, and go ahead and run the model and go ahead and see what the results look like in the differences. So that would go ahead and run, and in a second you get to go ahead and see what that looks like as far as the results. And so here's the result that runs. And in case you couldn't see, I was doing a weight of 0.4, 0.4, and 0.2 instead of even weights. And so you can compare the new run to the original run. You can see up here, it gets a higher relative weight, less relative weight down here. You can zoom into the region we were looking at earlier and see, how that's different. And so, yeah, that's how everything's looking right now. And thank you for your attention. Oh, the reason this is blurry is because I ran the model at map quality low, which was the fastest. Okay. Yeah, I should, I guess, probably point out also that for any time you go ahead and press on a particular location, it will go ahead and tell you what the relative value is for all of those particular cells. So for this particular cell reporting unit, the invasive management priority was a 0.85 on a scale of 0 to 1, erosion 0.74, and low regenerative capacity is scale of 0. Weighted sum is a 0.53. Once you normalize that for the region, you get your top value of 0.86. So thank you.
Is the overview of using it. So here's the backup slides that we don't need to use. And just wrapping up here. I should put the caveat that we use what's known as EEMS extended, in the fact that regular EEMS is fuzzy logic, as I mentioned before. And with EEMS extended, we're using fuzzy sets to define the input variables and normalize them, but then we combine them using weighted linear combination, which is weighted sums. We do that, A, because it's consistent with WHIPPET, so people that know WHIPPET will be familiar with this. Also, we need some social scientists out there to evaluate the cognitive differences and pros and cons of those two, and that would be an interesting analysis. So as far as future work and applications goes, yeah, the idea is to link it with an adaptive actions spatial database, and the vision for a future application of this would be to be able to really spin up the GIS layer using existing data in year one, so that you can actually get a rapid assessment going and you can get on the ground field work going in that critical first 12 months after the fire. And then you can be gathering additional data to fine tune that. So that's like the take home message there. And this can be done at multiple scales, of course. And so By way of follow-up, I really encourage anybody that's interested to email me, and you can ask to be on the mailing list for the manuscripts that are in process, or the preprint that's available, and also to co-develop a grant or an application, or really any EEMS collaboration. You can see that you could do this for conservation planning, not just management. And a huge shout out to the co-authors and all the citizen scientists and everybody else that helped make this possible. Josie Lesage was my special partner in crime, and then a special thanks to Steve Winhager, who I wrote the grant proposal with, and yeah, thanks to everybody else there, and thanks to Rebecca for coming out here to present and being a co-author, and Greg, who's coming up next. So thank you all very much.
Beautiful. Okay, well, I wish I could be with you all in person. It would be really great homecoming post-pandemic to visit with many of you whom I know and collaborate with on a regular basis. But lacking that ability, here I am from Fort Collins, Colorado, and really excited to share with you, this whole project broadly. And, thanks to Rebecca and John for fantastic introductions to this really important work. I will kind of today really focus on hopefully what kind of wraps up this package for you all late in the day. And that's really focusing on platform interoperability and integrations to make all of these visions and capabilities possible for actionable citizen science. I'm Greg Newman. I'm a research scientist at the Natural Resource Ecology Lab at Colorado State University and co-founder and director of citsci.org. So let's see if I can click through this here. Okay, so at the heart of all of this work is really this problem of lacking efficient ways to monitor, model, and predict phenomenon over time, whether that be erosion post-fire, whether that be noxious weed invasion post-fire, whether it be hopefully noxious weed mitigation post-restoration in like a before-after control impact kind of restoration ecology context. So at the end of the day, we need to be able to monitor these phenomena, model them, and predict what might happen in the future, right? And we have seen, of course, this is old news. This is yesterday's news. We've been able to do these spatial temporal models, and John just shared some of the most cutting edge of those from these fuzzy logic set predictions that EEMS is able to do. And of course, this is eBird data of the Savannah sparrow back in 2008. And this is really taking yesterday's news. We all know we can do this, but we got to recognize that this is contingent upon looking retrospective at observations that have been made, and then using, say, species distribution modeling to make these predictions in the future. And of course, at the heart of our ability to do this type of work is outsourcing tasks to a distributed group of people, of course, crowdsourcing, and of course, community science, citizen science, participatory science, public participation in scientific research, and a lot of it, community-based monitoring, all of these various approaches to engaging the public in scientific research. And so what John shared, though, it takes all of this, yesterday's news, to the next level. And what that does is it takes our integration of geospatial technologies, decision support systems, spatial decision support systems, and community science, citizen science, crowdsourcing, participatory science, and the like, and bringing all that together in a decision support system that, of course, is a system supporting our decision making, right, in terms of an adaptive management context. So our real opportunity is not yesterday's news. It's let's build upon that. And so the way we build on that is engaging the public in, of course, the baseline monitoring and long-term monitoring over time. And there's even cost efficiencies we've learned about today that Rebecca shared in terms of cost savings and potentially, scalable cost savings. Hard to figure that out. But moreover, making predictions of these phenomena over time in systems like EEMS that can help us look forward. So how can we do this? And the way we can do this efficiently is through data interoperability, which we'll talk about how we did that in this case. And then we'll talk about model and data platform integration through what's called application programming interfaces, or APIs, to really build out what we consider a spatial decision support system. And so at the start of this process is really data integration. So if I go back a slide, that first one is data interoperability and data integration. And at the heart of that, of course, is collecting data. And so in this context, we use iNaturalist and Anecdata. I'll talk about another platform that's ready and capable of basically helping volunteers participate together in collaboration with scientists and stakeholders and NGOs and partners to collect actionable citizen science data. And so what we have done is built a platform called citsci.org that enables that data collection, right? But it also enables that collaboration formatively that Rebecca alluded to kind of co-create your questions. What do you need to know? Do you need to know where to restore sites? Do you need to know where to monitor sites? Do you need to know where to release goats? Do you need to know where to spread sugar? Do you need to know, where to, build a new trail? So let's think about co-creating those formative questions. And so, of course, what citsci.org is, in a quick, super 1-minute introduction, is a platform to power citizen science, community science projects globally. Our mission is really simple: help you do great citizen science. All that to say, we really want to be community-driven and help people do great community science. And at the heart of our work is values recognizing two key things: people and science, and really valuing the work that people can collaborate together to do, together with scientists, stakeholders, economists, social scientists, and others, to really do actionable citizen science. We value comprehensive support. These things are not easy. They do not come free. Rebecca showed a value of how much it costs to train these folks in the California SCAR. And so we need to help make that less expensive and make that more efficient. And so, of course, our platform is comprehensive in nature to help make that easy. And then, of course, we value collaboration and co-creation. And so at citsci.org, basically, there's a series of projects we support. There's over 1,000, maybe 1,500 of them now. I've lost track. And of course, everything from water quality to amphibians to bats to fish to noxious weeds to even other more social phenomena like graffiti and accessible handicap sidewalks, for example. So very, very flexible platform. And at the end of the day, a project like Utah Water Watch comes up together with their stakeholders and builds out a project profile like this, and builds out a project and really co-creates an actionable plan to create actionable data for decision making. And so this is a project profile. You can upload monitoring locations. You can do that opportunistically at predefined locations, maybe do stratified random sampling, all of the above, to end up with what we call a protocol, a data sheet, right, for volunteers to follow. And Rebecca has done some great work to showcase today evidence that shows that volunteers can do this and how well the quality of those data may compare to the quality of experts walking those same trails, right? And so we might assess percent ocular cover estimates and compare those to professionals. So here's where you simply, in a drag and drop interface, simply drag a question type into your data sheet, kind of like Legos, build them up, and then you can specify required, optional, and even min-max values for QA/QC, and you end up with, basically, we've all used these sorts of tools, a data sheet where people then collect data like this. And this just happens to be an example of the Land Institute's civic science work with perennial wheat grains, engaging the public across all latitudes and longitudes to grow novel grains of perennial wheat, to look at the growth and disease incidence and other things associated with those new grains that the Land Institute is developing. So in any event, of course, in our case, we engage the public to map and monitor invasive species. So you end up with those observations, and at these locations, you can assess trends over time. And so the system spits out real-time data for the parameters or variables measured by volunteers and participants, whether they be novice or expert or writ large together, to look at air temperature, water temperature, pH, percent cover, etc. We've even been able to launch, as of late, visual trends of categorical data. This is the Bald Eagle Watch project, Gratis, the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, along the Front Range of Colorado, looking at bird behavior over time, which gets really interesting when you start looking at these various behaviors and the incidence of them in changing climate times. So that's all well and great, but back to our problem here. So we can collect data, we can visualize trends in these data looking backwards from yesterday's news over time based on the citizen science data and integrated with professional data. But can we make predictions? And so John's talk really led us to this real opportunity, bringing EEMS into the equation and bringing all this data together, whether they be geospatial data sets, drone data, USGS data, Park Service data, county expert data, citizen science data from iNaturalist, citizen science data from ANIC data, citizen science data from citsci.org, all of the above together in meaningful ways to improve conservation decision making. So how on earth can we do that? And that's where the real trick gets, because with every one of these nuanced systems is rather tricky in how they work. And so that gets us back to the importance of data integration and platform interoperability. And the big ticket item here is those APIs to make a comprehensive spatial decision support system possible. So this is how we conceptualize these systems coming together to start making really actionable predictions in the conservation biology context. And so in green is this layer in the middle kind of called data integration. So that's where we take that USGS data, that SBG, Santa Barbara Botanical Garden data, that maybe county data, maybe we take the INET observations, ANIC data, citsci, and then we bring them together with these citizen science data and geospatial data like digital elevation models and other such, maybe Palma drought index data, PRISM data, climate projections, and bring all of those data together in data integration. But that's just the half of it, because now we got to do the blue. We've got to bring these data together into some sort of systems that can take models, whether they be agent-based models, spatial agent-based models, fuzzy logic models, etc., and bring them together for spatial analyses so we can get spatial decision support and answer our questions we started with at the bottom. So again, just to highlight, in our case, these are some of the partners that collaborated on that first step, that data integration step: CalFlora, USGS, citsci, INAT, ANIC data. And then when you look at what we mean by data integration, data are just bits of information, the percent cover of noxious weeds at this particular quadrat. And so that's raw data, right? But we need to derive some summative information, say the mean percent cover along this reach of trail, some summary statistics that then morph the data into information, into knowledge, and ultimately actionable wisdom that we can make decisions based on. And so again, in green, there's those data integration pieces. In blue, there's those systems integration and spatial decision support pieces that really make this go from raw data to actionable knowledge and wisdom. So all of that hopefully makes sense. And how do we do that? We do that with what's called an application programming interface, or API. And the citsci API is one of these. This is all open source technology, and therefore anyone can capitalize on the citsci API to make what's called GET requests. So computer A makes a phone call to our computer and says, give me data. And you can parameterize that GET request to say, hey, I want data about this species in this location. And so this is what our collaborative team kind of started doing to make these requests, whether they be requests from INET or ANIC data or citsci, and make these requests to get the data we needed to bring those disparate data sets together to start solving some of these use cases. So I've been flying through this. I think my recording says the same stuff that I'm sharing today in about 18 minutes, and I might hit 15 today. And I know we're a little bit behind, so hopefully that gives us time for 10 minutes of discussion. But I'll close with a vision for some of the use cases behind some of these integrations, and for example, in our case, we needed to bring together that citizen science data with professional data to get this monstrous set of species occurrence data, right? And so we managed to successfully do that as input into EEMS. A second use case might include bringing SITSI data together with INAT data. And the reason you might do that as a use case is you might be able to report to SITSI the soil erosion data. You might be able to measure bulk density. You might be able to measure slope or like breached water bars on a trail. Any other, because the system is very flexible, it follows what's called an entity attribute value data model where you can basically collect information about any phenomenon. And so that's very flexible. It has challenges for us, of course, to manage, but it's quite great for citizen science, for heterogeneous project topics and domains. So we might have data that has that, say, soil data, INAT, and species occurrence data. And INAT, of course, excels at species occurrence data. And so we might bring those together, right? Because we want all the occurrence data from SITSI. We also want all the occurrence data from INAT, but we also want to take advantage of any soil data that is in SITSI but lacking in INAT. So in any event, and there's another use case related to INAT that's not listed here that is we also want to integrate with INAT, which I'll talk about later, for the advantage of taxonomic identification. But thirdly, the use case here is taking those species occurrence data and that's what I was just trying to say. Leveraging the crowd of INAT, the large crowd of INAT to help gain QA/QC research grade observations and capitalize on that taxonomic expertise. Fourth is a use case looking at invasive plants photography and integrating with the Zooniverse, which we've been able to do from a systems integration perspective so that you could synchronize photos submitted to SITSI and asynchronously have a different set of volunteers classify those images with respect to some phenomenon. So for example, if your protocol said take a photo of 1 square meter and then have other volunteers estimate how much % cover was occupied by that species for like ocular % cover estimates, you could do that on the Zooniverse. And that might train machine learning algorithms to make that from a computer perspective. So then computers might be able to take an image and make a guess as to how much % cover that invasive species occupied. And then lastly, these EEMS predictions, I'd like to push us to think even further to say, okay, now that we've got those model outputs John showed under scenario A and scenario B, which is really great for SimCity, like simulations, we can then say, taking the best simulation and the best weights, we can say, let's take that and maybe use that as input into yet another model for another prediction for another reason. And so for that reason, at the heart of all of this is a motivation, there we go, a motivation to really make and build conservation decision-making tools that are useful for others, right? And so for me, success is doing something that allows somebody to do something so that they can be successful. So really, we're trying to build these APIs that others can build upon to be even more successful. And so for us, what's next to close out here, to really capitalize on building out these APIs, building out our own applications, to identify shared use cases for improved other integrations and other system integrations through these APIs. And so kind of to close, I think I'm pretty good on time, John. I'll close out with this slide, and that is a vision for what's kind of a state of integrations, if you will. And so, through this collaboration with John and Josie and many others here, Rebecca and others, we've learned that we need to start not just integrating with data platforms, but also spatial decision support systems. And so what's shown in black are integrations we've successfully accomplished. We've been busy to think about starting to make integrations happen. So we've integrated with SciStarter, the use case there being a project gets started on SITSI, and then they can synchronize their directory listing of their citizen science project on the SciStarter network, which really excels at volunteer recruitment. And so we've also integrated with the Zooniverse, as I described, with sharing volunteer photos with Zooniverse projects, and then the Zooniverse volunteers can subsequently tackle those image classification tasks, and then those results can feed back into SITSI. So we've successfully launched that integration, and we'll a SciStarter affiliate as a platform. And more recently, we've built an R plugin so that, of course, you and your command line R programming interface can use our plugin to grab data from our API, and then, of course, do statistical analysis on it. But we've yet to solve this most important task that we're here to talk about today, and that is integrating with these spatial decision support systems and models. And so hopefully this becomes a black circle very soon, as does something we feel really important with integration with INET. So with that, I will close and happily stop sharing my screen, hopefully, if I can figure that out. There we are. And let's see, how do I stop? There it is. And return it back to you, John. So I'm happy to take any questions and dive into discussion.
All right, thank you. We can... Wonderful. All right, thanks, Greg. That was fantastic. And thanks, everybody, for sticking around through that. And now we have a few moments for questions, and then we'll transition over to the citizen science or the participatory and citizen science networking event. So some questions in the back. Probably so that people online can hear. So we're going to pass the microphone for the question.
Thanks very much, everyone. My question is actually for Rebecca, but I think it could go for anyone who wants to speak on it. And it has to do with the framework that you shared at the beginning, where you have adaptive management plus stewardship equals citizen science. I imagine there's like a few other ways that could be organized too, right? Where like citizen science plus adaptive management gets stewardship or whatever. I'm curious if you have any if you've thought about that or have more to add to that kind of, that little model.
Sorry, take the mask off. There's, I think, a million ways to kind of conceptualize this. I think the idea being that if we sort of where we nest citizen science and how we engage people, I think has a lot to do with how we view their role in that kind of overall enterprise or that overall process. And that's something that I think it's all too easy to forget thinking about, especially in the kinds of projects where people might say, hey, we just kind of need a free labor force, or we just need people to help us. And it's not to say that people can't help them, and they can, but that there's probably more going on with those individuals, and there's probably more we could be sort of capitalizing on when people are involved, and that when we want to try to do these sorts of things and engage in these kind of adaptively managed process, and we do it without people, and without the investment of the individuals who actually have a pretty big stake in this, it can really sort of tank the whole process before it's even gotten started. And I think that's the part that really has shocked me and caught me off guard, is that you think everything's going well and you think you've really convinced a group of individuals to really engage in a process that you feel like, oh, we're all on board on that. And I always say it takes sometimes years to set up something really amazing and then like days to tear it apart, right? And such a short period of time to destabilize that overall endeavor. So I think that's a real important piece of this process. No matter which kind of conceptual frame you take it, you should probably take one.
Fantastic. That was very well said. Do we have any more questions before we transition into the next event? Okay, and there were no questions online, right? Okay. Wonderful. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for coming to that symposium. And now we get to transition to the exciting next step.